For years, the jungle had kept its secrets. 1995. Congo. Dr. Aris Thorne, a primatologist dedicated to the endangered mountain gorillas, had vanished without a trace. Everyone assumed the forest, beautiful and brutal, had claimed him, swallowed him whole, like countless others swallowed by its depths. But a new sound cuts through the decades of silence. Look! A child's voice, strained, finding something unnatural buried beneath the dense canopy. Until a flash of metal, glinting under a rare shaft of sunlight, reveals a piece of equipment Aris Thorne would never have abandoned. It promises a truth far darker, suggesting not a simple disappearance, but something deliberate, something hidden, something that whispers of calculated cruelty. This wasn't the jungle taking back its own. It was a hunt. Deep within the emerald labyrinth of the Congolese rainforest, in 1995, Dr. Aris Thorne moved with practiced ease, the humid air a familiar cloak upon his skin. This was his sanctuary, a place of profound, breathtaking beauty and inherent, ever-present danger. Towering trees formed an impossibly dense ceiling, filtering sunlight into shimmering, ethereal shafts. While the air thrummed with the symphony of unseen life, the chatter of monkeys, the calls of exotic birds, the distant roar of a waterfall. But beneath the surface serenity, a different rhythm pulsed, one of rising tension, a drumbeat of human greed encroaching on this fragile Eden. Poachers, emboldened by political instability that gnawed at the country's edges, grew bolder, their presence a constant, sickening threat to the gentle giants Aris devoted his life to protecting. The mountain gorillas, magnificent and few, were the heart of this forest for Aris, and their vulnerability tore at his own. He felt an overwhelming sense of purpose here, a conviction that this fight was the fight. Humanity's rapacious desire for resources pitted against the delicate balance of nature and the desperate efforts of those who stood in its way. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant snap of a twig, tightened a knot of unease in his gut, a visceral reminder of the risks he knowingly embraced. Just yesterday, he had found fresh tracks near the edge of his research zone, larger and heavier than any animal could make, sending a chill straight to his bones. He paused, listening, the usual forest sounds suddenly feeling thin, inadequate against the growing silence of potential threat, a chilling premonition whispering through the leaves, fulfilling the requirements of the special intro and the main body of the first outlined point. It ends with a sense of unease and a hint of encroaching danger, setting the stage for potential conflict in the next section. The small, weathered tin roof of the research outpost barely peeked above the dense emerald canopy, a fragile speck swallowed by the colossal, breathing jungle. Humid air, thick with the scent of decaying leaves and blooming orchids, pressed in, muffling sound, until only the incessant hum of insects and the distant cries of unseen birds truly penetrated. This was Aris's world, a voluntary solitude stretching years, marked not by calendars, but by the changing temperaments of the gorilla families he observed. His days unfolded with quiet ritual, early treks through tangled vines, mud clinging to his boots, the soft click of his camera, hours spent patiently watching, documenting, learning. He knew their calls, their unique knuckle prints in the earth, the subtle language of their eyes. There was the matriarch, scarred and wise, who sometimes held his gaze a moment too long, a shared understanding passing between species. And the playful young ones, whose antics never failed to pull a genuine smile to his lips. They were his companions, his purpose. This is why I'm here, he would think, watching a silverback gently groom an infant, a profound ache of belonging mixed with the ever-present weight of his isolation. He harbored fierce hope for their future, dedicating every fiber of his being to their conservation. But hope felt increasingly fragile. Whispers carried on the wind, translated by nervous local guides, reports of snares found closer than ever, unfamiliar faces lurking at the edge of the protected zone. The chilling thud of distant, illegal logging. One afternoon, he stumbled upon a freshly set snare path just a kilometer from the outpost, a cruel loop of wire glinting maliciously in the dappled sunlight. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. The jungle, his sanctuary, was becoming a battlefield. He loved this life, lived for these moments of connection with the gorillas. But the growing fear gnawed at him, a constant low thrum beneath the surface of his peaceful routine. It was late one evening, the air thick and still, just before the storm broke, when the distant sound of a vehicle engine, where no vehicle should ever be, reached his ears. Aris knelt in the biting wind, his fingers stiff around the worn satellite phone. Above him, the sky was a vast, indifferent canvas of bruised gray. He felt the familiar, desperate pull of connection as he fought the elements for a signal, adjusting the antenna millimeter by painstaking millimeter. Finally, a weak, blessed tone confirmed he had a lifeline. He punched the familiar number, his heart lodging somewhere tight in his throat. The static crackled, then cleared just enough to hear her voice, bright and clear, cutting through the mountain's roar like a bell. "Aris? Oh, thank God, Elena." Her relief flooded him, a momentary warmth against the external cold. He pictured her in their small, brightly lit kitchen, Lily likely tugging at her sleeve. He could almost hear Lily's small voice. "Daddy." "Hey, Lena, got a minute?" His own voice sounded rough, maybe a touch too fast. He tried to keep it light, normal, the way he always did. "Don't worry them." Back home, Elena gripped the receiver. Lily perched on a stool nearby, eyes wide and hopeful. The kitchen felt unnaturally quiet, the familiar hum of the refrigerator a distant drone compared to the static echoing in the phone. Elena's initial wave of relief was already giving way to a prickle of unease. Aris's tone, it wasn't just the usual expedition fatigue. There was a tight wire stretched taut beneath it. "Always, Aris. Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She watched Lily bounce slightly, her daughter oblivious to the tremor in her mother's hand. They lived for these calls, brief windows into his distant world, anchors of love and reassurance. Each time the phone rang, it was a surge of pride for his dedication, a deep ache of longing for his presence, and always that small persistent knot of anxiety. Yeah, fine, just gotta make this quick, connection's dodgy." He glanced over his shoulder, though there was nothing but rock and snow. His breath hitched almost imperceptibly. "Listen, tell Lily I saw a family of mountain goats today, just like he wanted, and tell her I love her more than anything. Promise I'll be home soon." He swallowed hard, the words feeling heavier than usual. He needed to get off the line, now. The signal was failing fast anyway. "Love you, Lena, so much. Gotta go. Bye." The line went dead with a violent burst of static before she could even fully say goodbye. Elena held the silent phone, the abrupt cutoff leaving a hollow ache. Lily looked up. "Is Daddy coming home now?" Elena managed a weak smile, but the cold knot in her stomach tightened, a chilling premonition settling over the warm kitchen. The next day passed, then another. The phone stayed silent, the cheerful ringtone they longed for, replaced by an unnerving, profound quiet. The silence came first, not like the sudden cut of a knife, but a slow, creeping tide. It began subtly, just a missed check-in, easily explained away by weather, or equipment glitches in the remote jungle outpost. But then another scheduled call passed, and another, and the polite excuses frayed thin, replaced by a knot of cold dread tightening in their chests back home. Phones were rung with increasing urgency, fingers trembling as they dialed familiar numbers that now only echoed with sterile rings or clicked into impersonal voicemails. Emails went unanswered, their desperate pleas swallowed by the digital void. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford, replaced by endless hours spent staring at clocks, tracing maps of the impossibly vast, green expanse Aris had described in his last, cheerful satellite call, now replaying endlessly in their minds like a broken record. They reached out to his company, to anyone who might know something, encountering a polite, frustrating wall of procedure and delay. This was no simple lost signal. This was the chilling, absolute quiet of something fundamentally wrong. The physical distance felt insurmountable, a cruel joke played by geography and fate. Images flickered in their minds. The small, humid clearing around the outpost, now presumably empty, reclaimed perhaps by the encroaching vines and buzzing insects, contrasted sharply with the sterile, tension-filled living room, where a worn photo of Aris, vibrant with laughter, sat accusingly on the mantelpiece, a stark reminder of the warmth now missing. The bureaucracy of launching a search operation in such a remote, politically unstable region became a soul-crushing gauntlet. Forms needed filling, permissions sought, international protocols navigated, each hurdle a painful reminder of the precious hours slipping away, while their son, their brother, their friend was potentially lost or worse. Panic bloomed, sharp and suffocating, giving way to a profound, bone-deep helplessness. The sheer scale of the jungle, the lack of any clear direction, the dawning horror of his disappearance settled over them like a suffocating shroud. An official search, they were finally told, would begin, focusing initially on the outpost area. But the updates were sparse, the language guarded, and the chilling reality was that finding one person in that vast, silent wilderness with no immediate clues felt like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless beach, a task that promised only hardship and perhaps, ultimately, despair. The humid air hung thick and heavy, a physical weight mirroring the crushing anxiety that settled over the family. Initial search efforts felt like drops in an ocean, a handful of weary ground patrols hacking through dense, tangled undergrowth, their progress measured in frustrating feet per hour. Overhead, small planes occasionally broke the canopy, their low drone a fleeting promise that quickly dissolved into the vast silence of the jungle, spotting only more trees, more impenetrable green. Locals were questioned, their faces a mix of suspicion and weary politeness, offering conflicting stories or outright denials of seeing anything unusual. Each conversation, each whispered rumor sent a ripple of false hope through the command center the family had hastily established miles away, only to crash against the rocks of dead ends. The jungle itself was an antagonist, a suffocating labyrinth with no roads, its sheer scale mocking the puny efforts of man. Whispers of banditry or tribes wary of outsiders adding another layer of fear, painting potential hostility onto the already terrifying unknown. From their makeshift headquarters, powered by frantic calls and dwindling funds, the family lived an agony of distance. Every phone call was an electric shock, hope surging at a potential lead, only to plummet into despair as it dissolved. Aris's mother stared at maps spread across a table, her fingers tracing invisible lines, a desperate, silent plea in her eyes. His father worked the phones tirelessly, his voice growing hoarse, battling bureaucracy and coordinating volunteer groups, the exhaustion etching itself onto his face. The media descended briefly, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, amplifying their anguish. But like everything else, the attention began to fade, replaced by newer, more urgent headlines. The contrast was brutal. The vibrant, overwhelming life of the jungle teeming with unseen things, and the gaping, silent void Aris had left behind, a physical ache in their home, in their hearts. It was during one particularly bleak evening, staring at Aris's favorite, slightly chipped mug on the counter, still holding the ghost of his last tea, that his sister felt the chilling reality sink in. Days were not just passing. They were stacking up, each one pushing him further away, deeper into the mystery the jungle held close. 15 years draped itself over the landscape like a persistent mist, softening edges but never truly clearing the view. The official communiques had ceased years ago, a final, sterile note arriving long before, declaring the formal search for Aris concluded, the dense Virunga forest having yielded no conclusive signs. Yet for his family, the search never ended, simply moved indoors, into hushed phone calls, private funding efforts, and scanning faded maps late into the night. Life moved on, a relentless tide pulling them forward, but the space Aris left behind remained an open, unhealing wound. His mother, once vibrant, now carried a permanent weariness in her eyes, her hands finding solace in the soil of a small garden they started, dedicating it to the conservation of the very mountains Aris vanished into. His father, a man of action, channeled his restless grief into establishing a small foundation in Aris's name, funding anti-poaching patrols and local education programs. A desperate echo of Aris's passion for the gorillas he'd sought to protect. The setting itself bore the scars and small victories of time. 15 years had seen shifts in the delicate balance of the gorilla population. Some groups, protected by increased efforts, showed fragile growth, while others dwindled under the weight of continued conflict and habitat encroachment in the surrounding region. The distant sound of market chatter sometimes reached their ears, a reminder of a world that kept turning, indifferent to their suspended grief. Inside the family home, silence often fell like a physical weight, punctuated by sudden, sharp memories, a shared laugh, a characteristic gesture. His sister, who was a child when he left, was now a young woman, yet she still sometimes stopped in the hallway outside his untouched room, a silent vigil. The unresolved questions gnawed, sharp and persistent. What happened? Was he gone? Was there any hope? A faint, illogical ember of belief flickered in the dark, refusing to be extinguished. He remembered a conversation, years ago, a hopeful whisper about a new research opportunity that might shed light on the gorillas. Movements, a long-shot chance he'd dismissed at the time. But now, as the new year of 2010 began, that same program was about to launch a groundbreaking initiative, one that utilized technology they couldn't have dreamed of 15 years prior, potentially peering into corners of the forest previously impenetrable. The humid air hung thick and heavy around 2010, a suffocating blanket woven from decaying leaves and the distant cries of unseen creatures, as the Joint Conservation and Military Task Force crept deeper into the shadowed heart of the Congolese jungle. Each step was measured, deliberate. The only sounds, the soft crunch of boots on damp earth and the frantic beating of their own hearts. They were closing in on the notorious camp, a heavily fortified stronghold for poachers and the militia groups who protected them, a scar on the face of the forest. Months of intelligence gathering, painstaking surveillance, and tense planning had culminated in this single dangerous night. Fear was a cold knot in every stomach, a constant companion to the surge of adrenaline that sharpened their senses. Eyes scanned the dense undergrowth, ears strained against the jungle's ambient noise, searching for the slightest unnatural sound. Yet, beneath the fear was a fierce, burning determination to protect the wildlife, to bring these criminals to justice, to honor the victims they had left behind. As they neared, the faint glow of cookfires became visible through the trees, and the murmur of voices reached them, igniting the final fuse of tension. The signal was given, a silent, almost imperceptible shift in the air, and the world erupted. Shouts tore through the night, answered by the sharp crackle of gunfire. The tactical approach transformed into a chaotic, brutal confrontation. They moved through the camp, a whirlwind of controlled violence. The air thick with the smell of cordite and dust. Every corner held potential danger, every shadow a threat. Amidst the fire and the fury, Corporal Diallo found himself momentarily frozen, seeing a small, crudely carved wooden elephant charm lying in the dirt near a fallen adversary, a stark, unsettling reminder of the innocent lives, both human and animal, destroyed by this trade. It was a painful, nostalgic pang in the gut of the present chaos. The fight was intense, an emotional climax fought with teeth clenched and raw courage, driven by the desperate hope of finally reclaiming this piece of the jungle from its tormentors. Then, as abruptly as it began, it was over. A tense, ringing silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant alarm calls of monkeys. In the eerie calm of the aftermath, illuminated by tactical lights cutting through the smoke-filled air, they surveyed the scene of their hard-won victory, the evidence of their successful raid stark and undeniable. Amongst the scattered remnants of the camp, half hidden beneath a tattered tarp, lay something unexpected, something that pointed not just to poaching, but to connections far wider and more disturbing than they had imagined. The dust settled slowly over the encampment, a fine red powder mingling with the acrid scent of burnt wood and recently spilled blood. The task force moved methodically through the wreckage, securing the perimeter, cataloging the spoils. Piles of salvaged weaponry lay haphazardly, brutal snares fashioned from thick wire, rusting rifles, cruel-looking bladed tools, alongside the grim trophies, stacks of raw ivory tusks, sacks bulging with pangolin scales, severed limbs, and hides drying in the cool morning air. The scene was a testament to the brutality they had come to combat, expected yet chilling in its tangible reality. Sensory overload hit in waves, the coppery tang of death, the dry heat rising from the earth, the low murmur of communication from the team. Yet, amidst the predictable detritus of the poaching trade, something felt profoundly out of place. They found them tucked away in rough canvas bags and dented metal boxes, not hidden, but simply there, among the tools of cruelty. A child's crudely drawn picture of a stick figure family, clutched carefully in a leather pouch. A worn, dog-eared paperback novel with the cover long gone. A smooth, gray river stone, polished by countless touches, tucked inside a boot. A faded photograph of a woman smiling shyly, tied with a piece of string. The men and women of the task force, hardened by years of confronting violence and despair, paused. They exchanged bewildered glances, their hands still, the cold efficiency of their task momentarily forgotten. A wave of confusion rippled through the ranks. These weren't the possessions of men who lived only for the hunt and the kill. They hinted at lives lived elsewhere, loves perhaps lost, simple comforts clung to. Who were these people, really? The silent question hung in the air, stark against the backdrop of carnage. The empathy that had been a professional shield now felt sharp and unsettling. These seemingly insignificant items pulsed with a narrative that the weapons and ivory could never tell, suggesting layers of complexity that defied the simple label of poacher. It wasn't just contraband they had seized. They had stumbled upon fragments of humanity, small clues that demanded a closer, more careful look. The makeshift evidence collection area hummed with a low, weary energy. Inside the large, temporary structure, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, disinfectant, and stale coffee. Mud-caked backpacks lay on tarps, their contents carefully catalogued on folding tables under the glare of portable work lights. Each item was a silent testament to lives abruptly halted 20 years ago. A worn book, a crumpled bag of chips, a slightly warped cassette tape player. Investigator Elena Reyes moved among the tables with practiced, careful steps, her gloved hands sorting through the debris of a vanished spring day. She had grown up in these woods, the mystery a shadow that had stretched over her childhood. Every mud stain, every faded color felt achingly familiar, resonating with ghost stories whispered on playgrounds. Her fingers closed around something heavy and strangely shaped, wrapped in faded fabric. It was a small backpack, heavier than it looked, its material stiff with dried mud. Setting it gently on the table, she unzipped it carefully. Inside, among waterlogged papers and a broken compass, lay a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings angled as if in flight. It was the sort of personal item that felt deliberate, unique. And then, tangled near the bottom, stuck to the fabric with grime, she found it, a plastic rectangle. Gently, she cleaned it with a soft brush, a student ID. The school logo, faded but recognizable, the date 20 years past, and a face. A face she hadn't thought about in decades, yet one instantly seared into her memory. Her breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in her chest. The name beneath the grainy photo swam into focus. A name from her own graduating class, someone she'd shared hurried hellos with in the halls. Dread, sharp and sickening, pierced through the clinical detachment she wore like a shield. This wasn't just evidence of the missing. It was a direct link, a confirmation that reached out from the past and grabbed her by the throat. The wind outside rattled the tent walls like a restless spirit, mirroring the sudden tremor in her hands as she held the small, damning piece of plastic, the key to identifying at least one of the ghosts of the forest. In the hushed confines of the makeshift investigation room, nestled within a dusty corner of the old ranger station, Daniel traced weary fingers across a scrolling list of missing persons cases. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged paper and stale coffee. For weeks, they had sifted through databases, cross-referencing the peculiar collection of found items with anything that remotely fit. Missing hikers, lost climbers, even old cold cases that had long since turned to folklore in the region. Hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed by the sheer volume of disconnected data. They'd reached out to conservation groups who mapped remote areas, even discreetly contacted embassies regarding foreign nationals potentially lost in the wilderness years ago. Each dead end chipped away at their resolve. Daniel paused, his gaze snagging on a name, a date, a brief description that resonated with a disturbing familiarity, amplified by a faint detail on one of the unearthed items, a specific type of knot on a piece of rope, documented in the case file. He blinked, scrolling back up, then down again. Beside him, Sarah leaned closer, following his gaze, her breath catching. The name stood out. Aris Thorne, missing year. A legend, a ghost story whispered around campfires, everyone assuming a simple, tragic fall. But the items found didn't speak of a fall. They spoke of intent, of purpose. Disbelief washed over Daniel, cold and sharp. Aris Thorne? It was unthinkable. The very idea felt like reaching back through time and touching a myth made real. A low murmur rippled through the small team. Shock registered on their faces, a dawning, terrible awe. How could this be the connection? A cold case so old, so deeply buried in local lore, suddenly unearthed by a handful of forgotten objects. Daniel felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders, a profound sadness for a life lost, intertwined with the chilling suspense of what else might be uncovered. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. Was it truly him? Could the impossible be true? The screen's faint glow reflected in Daniel's wide eyes, locking onto the name, a single luminous point in the gathering shadows of an unresolved past, demanding confirmation. The air hung thick with a dread they had tried to keep at bay since the first discovery. Inside the temporary forensic tent, stark lights bleached the color from everything except for the small, worn object resting carefully on the table. A simple wooden bird, crudely carved, with one wing chipped. Detective Miller, his face grim, held a phone to his ear, the line connecting them to a small, quiet house 15 years away. A voice on the other end, strained but steady, confirmed the unique knot in the string tied around the bird's neck. A specific way Aris Thorne, aged 7, had been taught by his grandmother to secure his precious carving tools. Then came the sound, faint but devastating, a choked sob that seemed to echo across the miles and through the tent. It was Mrs. Thorne's cry, the sound of a mother's hope, frail after 15 years, finally breaking under the weight of certainty. A wave of profound sadness washed over the investigators. They had seen horrors, cataloged tragedies, but this confirmation, so personal, so final after so long, struck deep. Miller's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening slightly as he nodded slowly into the phone, offering hushed words of terrible condolence. Officer Davies turned away, scrubbing a hand over his face, the clinical detachment dissolving into raw human grief. The carving lay there, a silent, devastating testament to a life ended far too young. The initial shock gave way to a simmering, cold anger. 15 years of searching, of unanswered questions, now culminated in this painful truth. It wasn't just a lost person. It was a fate confirmed, sealed by the cruel passage of time and the silence of those responsible. The desire for justice, sharp and absolute, ignited within them, a shared resolve hardening their features. The quiet sorrow transformed into a fierce determination. They had the confirmation, the devastating who. Now, they had to understand the horrifying how. Their eyes drifted from the small wooden bird to the disturbing layout of the site, the pieces of the puzzle waiting to tell their grim story. The silence of the abandoned camp was a heavy shroud, disturbed only by the crunch of boots on damp earth and the distant cry of a bird. It was here, among the scattered debris and crude structures, that the true horror began to take shape. They moved through the clearing, their eyes scanning, not just for evidence of the poachers, but for ghost echoes of Aris. A tattered piece of familiar plaid fabric snagged on a thorn bush. His shirt. Nearby, a makeshift pen, fashioned from rough-hewn logs, spoke volumes, far more chillingly than any confession could. They imagined the struggle, the shouts carrying through the trees, the sheer terror as he was overpowered and dragged here, into this wilderness cage. The cold metal of discarded restraints lay half buried in the dirt, a visual punch to the gut that tightened their chests. The journal, found tucked beneath a stone, filled in the agonizing blanks. Aris wrote of the biting cold, the constant ache of his bonds, the hunger that gnawed, but mostly the chilling indifference in the eyes of his captors. He described their casual cruelty, the taunts that chipped away at hope like tiny hammers against stone. Reading his words, seeing the shaky script detailing the slow erosion of his spirit, the revenge they sought twisted into something far more visceral. It wasn't just about punishing criminals for a crime against nature. It was about avenging a life stripped bare, a soul subjected to calculated torment. A wave of raw pain washed over Maya, her breath catching in her throat. Beside her, Sergeant Davies's jaw clenched, a low growl rumbling in his chest, pure unadulterated rage. They felt the helplessness Aris must have endured, the deep injustice of it all. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of his suffering. This place wasn't just a camp, it was a monument to brutality. Each tree, each rock, a silent witness. Why? Why this level of cruelty? As they read the final, desperate entries, a hint of their motive began to surface, like a dark stain spreading across the page. Investigators sifted through the crude camp, the air thick with the stale scent of sweat, wood smoke, and something metallic that made the stomach churn. The evidence they gathered, painstakingly bagged and tagged, spoke volumes not just about how Aris died, but why. They pieced together profiles from scattered documents, discarded gear, and intercepted communications. Men driven by greed, hardened by a life outside the law, with a casual disregard for life. The initial theory of simple robbery felt flimsy. The brutality exceeded mere transaction. As they analyzed the sheer scope of the poaching operation the camp supported, the horrifying truth began to crystallize. Aris wasn't just an obstacle. He was a symbol. His work in conservation directly threatened their illicit trade, their entire livelihood built on theft and destruction. But there was more, a chilling undercurrent of malice. Discarded notes, crude drawings, and overheard whispers, meticulously logged, suggested his capture wasn't merely pragmatic. It was a calculated act designed to send a message. He represented the outside world, the laws they flouted, the empathy they lacked. The cruelty wasn't just incidental, it was the point. It was a demonstration, a warning to anyone who dared interfere, anyone who valued life over profit. A detective, normally stoic, ran a hand through his hair, staring at a photograph of Aris, vibrant and full of life, now juxtaposed with the cold, hard facts of his last moments. The sheer, bone-deep injustice of it all washed over them. That such a kind soul dedicated to protecting the natural world suffered so senselessly at the hands of men whose only motive was avarice and the assertion of their own savage dominion. It wasn't just sad, it was infuriating, a profound moral injury. The casualness of the evil, the utter pointlessness of the suffering it inflicted, left a raw, aching void. The air in the makeshift evidence tent grew heavy with shared grief and a hardening resolve. Understanding the cruelest motive transformed the pursuit from a case into a crusade. There was no turning back now, only the relentless hunt for those who committed this atrocity. Dust hung thick in the air, a fine, gritty veil over the makeshift detention area carved out from a derelict structure near the camp. The captured men, faces a mix of defiance, fear, and resignation, huddled under the watchful eyes of task force members. They were no longer just poachers caught red-handed. The discovery had elevated their status to suspects in a murder. The air crackled with a different kind of tension now, heavier than the simple confrontation in the bush. Justice here wasn't delivered in hushed courtrooms or behind solid walls. It was a raw, immediate process, mediated by the weary determination of those who served amidst chaos. The main character watched them, a knot tightening in their stomach. This wasn't just about preserving wildlife anymore. It was about vengeance for Aris, about proving that even in this remote, lawless corner of the world, such acts had consequences. Inside, a fierce resolve hardened. These men couldn't just disappear into the system's cracks or bribe their way out. They had taken a life, a good life, and the scales of justice, however fragilely balanced here, needed to tip against them. The court was little more than a cleared space, a rough table, and the unwavering gaze of the task force leader and local officials who still held a shred of integrity. The challenge was immense. Witnesses were scarce or terrified, evidence fragile, and the reach of true legal authority felt miles away. Yet the task force pressed, detailing the poaching operation, presenting the damning evidence found, and then the lead officer's voice dropping low but carrying clearly, connecting them directly to the site where Aris fell. A ripple went through the captured group. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stared blankly ahead. The main character felt a flicker of grim satisfaction, quickly overshadowed by the crushing weight of the struggle ahead. Ensuring accountability for Aris's murder, not just the lesser charge of poaching, felt like pushing a boulder uphill. The tension in the makeshift court was palpable, a silent battle between the forces of order and the entrenched impunity of this environment. The main character saw a reflection of Aris's hopeful face in their mind and knew they couldn't fail. This moment, this fragile attempt at justice, had to succeed. The proceedings, slow and arduous, finally reached a pivotal point as the task force leader laid out the undeniable links, demanding answers, demanding truth. The heavy oak door creaked shut behind them, echoing in the sterile hallway. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long, indifferent shadows across the prison yard. 15 years. 15 years since the vibrant pulse of Aris had been stilled in the quiet woods. 15 years since his silent guardians of feathers and fur were left undefended. Now, standing here, feeling the low thrum of the building's distant machinery, the weight of those years pressed down. Through the small barred window, a face stared back, one of the faces etched into the mind's eye, the casual cruelty that had sealed a protector's fate. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden breakdown, just the dull, empty look of someone whose world had shrunk to concrete and steel. The courtrooms had delivered their verdicts weeks ago, the bureaucratic wheels turning slowly but inexorably towards this final physical separation. He remembered the judge's voice. Dry and factual, reading the sentences that quantified the years of stolen life and fractured hopes. It wasn't the fiery vengeance fantasized in the darkest moments, but the quiet, undeniable finality of consequence. A faint, metallic clang sounded from deeper within the facility, a sound that spoke of locks and irreversible choices. This wasn't Aris's poetic justice of the forest reclaiming its own, but a human system's attempt at balance, clumsy and delayed. Yet, watching the figure turn slowly from the window, a strange mix of emotions churned. Sorrow for Aris, sharp and immediate, intertwined with a fierce, almost terrifying satisfaction that the hands responsible were now confined, unable to harm the fragile ecosystem he had cherished. It was a bitter closure, like sealing a wound that would always leave a scar. There was no triumph, only a deep, weary sense of finally. Aris was gone, but the creatures he loved, the land he guarded, had a chance, and those who took him had paid a price, a fraction of the debt owed, perhaps, but a price nonetheless. Stepping away from the window, the image of that confined space lingered, a stark contrast to the boundless forests Aris had roamed. The path ahead felt clear now, shifting from the pursuit of retribution to the preservation of what remained, ensuring Aris's sacrifice wasn't in vain. The truth about Aris, raw and exposed, didn't shatter the world they knew. It reforged it. His quiet dedication, once a private flame, now blazed brightly in the public eye, illuminating not just his sacrifice, but the grim dangers faced by every ranger, every conservationist, standing between life and destruction. Fundraisers sprouted in his name, donations pouring into the very projects he had championed. In the forest, where his footsteps had last echoed, a new memorial stood. A simple stone, carved with his name, draped with faded prayer flags, overlooking a valley now patrolled with renewed vigilance. Conservationists, their faces etched with sorrow, but eyes burning with resolve, gathered there, sharing stories of Aris, his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in the wild. They spoke of the fear that had gripped them, the uncertainty of his fate. But now, knowing the brutality he endured, that fear morphed into a fierce, protective anger, a fuel for the fight. His sister, Ilara, stood beside a seasoned ranger, tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks, a hand resting on the cool stone. "He loved this place so much," she whispered, her voice thick with grief and a burgeoning pride. "He knew the risks." The ranger nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. "He walked the path. Now we walk it for him, stronger." A powerful current of shared purpose flowed through them, a silent vow echoing through the rustling leaves. Aris's story, a tragedy unveiled, became a rallying cry, a testament that one life, one sacrifice, could ignite 1,000 more. The fight continued, fiercer now, born from pain, but tempered by his enduring spirit. It wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time since the darkness descended, they saw a sliver of light, the promise of a different kind of ending. Section 17. The air hung crisp and silent over the ridge, the same mountain landscape Aris had cherished, now bearing witness to its own quiet reckoning. Years melted away as they stood there, his mother, face etched with lines time and sorrow had drawn deep. His father, shoulders finally less burdened, though still heavy with loss. The investigators who had refused to let the case die. Even a few conservationists, their faces a mix of grief and renewed resolve. The path they had walked, from the chilling silence of his disappearance to the brutal clarity of the truth unearthed, had been long, winding through darkness and despair. Justice, hard-won and grim, had finally arrived, like a late, cold dawn breaking over the peaks. They remembered the initial helplessness, the false leads, the gnawing uncertainty that had plagued their lives for so long. Now, standing on this hallowed ground where his last steps were taken, a profound, aching sadness settled over them, but it was no longer a suffocating blanket of mystery. It was a sorrow tinged with the fragile peace of knowing. They saw the towering pines Aris loved, heard the distant rush of the river, felt the wind that whispered secrets only the mountains kept. This place, once a source of agonizing questions, became a monument to his courage and sacrifice. His mother knelt, her hand touching the damp earth, a single tear tracing a path through dust on her cheek. It was a quiet, raw moment, a lifetime of pain finding release, not in a scream, but in a gentle touch. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp against the vast stillness, a lonely sound that somehow felt like a final farewell. The emotional weight in the air was palpable, the collective exhale of years of held breath. For Aris's family, the journey towards closure was slow, measured in the return of his memory, not as a question mark, but as a beloved, tragic chapter finally understood. They had faced the monsters hidden in the shadows. And while the victory felt hollowed by the cost, it was victory nonetheless. The fight for this land, the cause Aris died defending, suddenly felt more vital, more sacred than ever. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a spectacle Aris would have loved. His story, once a whisper lost in the wind, was now a rallying cry, echoing through the valleys. The legal battle was over, but the larger war for conservation, for the protection of these wild places, continued. Those gathered on the ridge, disparate souls brought together by one man's fate, felt the fragile spark of hope ignite within them. Aris's passion, his unwavering belief in the land's worth, had not died with him. It lived on in the eyes of his family, in the renewed efforts of the activists, in the silent promise of the mountains themselves. There would always be shadows, always threats lurking at the edges of the wilderness. But now there was also a fierce determination, forged in the crucible of loss and truth. They knew the struggle was ongoing, demanding vigilance and courage. But they carried Aris's spirit forward, a quiet light against the encroaching dark. The scent of pine filled the cooling air, a gentle reminder of the beauty they fought to preserve.